I'm going to be talking about the compliance and ethics program at SASOL and try to stick to the theme for the conference. First and foremost, I'm going to give a compliance overview. SASOL is JSE listed and a New York Stock Exchange company, so we have to comply with the mandate as outlined in King 3 code in terms of being an assurance provider to the board on regulatory compliance. And we are also a New York Stock Exchange listed company, so our compliance and ethics program is benchmarked against the US federal sentencing guidelines, meaning we have to, it's a multi-pronged approach which we use when assessing the effectiveness and adequacy of our compliance and ethics program. We must be able to detect, prevent, and correct. So those three pillars are what govern our compliance and ethics program. And the US federal sentencing guidelines are also important, as you've seen in the news. If there were to be any compliance failures, the United States Department of Justice will look at the robustness, the effectiveness, and the reasonable endeavors that the company did in terms of putting in place a compliance and ethics program. So this is a high-level overview in terms of the benefits of the compliance program. This is quite an important slide for us, especially from a compliance and ethics point of view, because unfortunately our function, even though it's quite important, it's still viewed as a back office support. So till something wrong happens, that's when we're taken seriously. So this sets to outline the benefits of the compliance program. And you might have seen in the news as well, in terms of our run-ins with the law insofar as the competition law compliance is concerned. So it is something that is important to us at SASOL to comply with the letter and spirit of the law. Okay, this slide shows what we have in place practically at SASOL in terms of our compliance program. So we have a compliance policy which outlines the scope of our mandate. And then we have a compliance methodology which includes and is benchmarked against best practices, which will be your KISA, your US federal sentencing guidelines, and it sort of codifies our approach to compliance. So for instance, at SASOL, our approach to compliance is a 5-phase approach. The first one is risk identification and risk prioritization, and that involves collaboration with group risk and group legal, because we cannot and we do not exist in isolation. So to ensure an integrated approach, we work closely with group risk. So for example, in our environment, the group risks that have been identified, it's competition law, it's anti-bribery and corruption, and it's sanctions. So in our compliance program, we ensure that we include what has been identified as group risks. And then, okay, I've touched on the compliance policy. And then the coverage plan, we have a coverage plan which sets out the compliance activities for the year, which is 12 months. So every quarter, we outline the compliance activities that we're going to embark on. So for example, in quarter one, it will be risk identification and prioritization with an intended outcome of identifying applicable legislation to all the operating model entities, or BUs as it's known generally. So in all the countries where SASOL operates, we have a dedicated resource in terms of a compliance resource. So that will be our phase one. So once that outcome, for instance, has been mapped out in terms of, okay, this is applicable legislation, we then embark on an exercise of risk rating that legislation with the intended outcome of focusing, because we adopt a risk-based approach. So if, for instance, the universe, regulatory universe has identified 20 pieces of legislation, so we adopt a risk-based approach, and then we focus on primary legislation, and secondary we only deal with if we've completed monitoring primary legislation. So our coverage plan also incorporates group priorities. So for example, one of the group priorities at SASOL is an investment in Mozambique, and our investment in the Lake Charles project in the United States. So it has to talk to group priorities. So what we've done post the announcement and communication of the group priorities insofar as those two areas are concerned. And the third one is safety and health. Being a mining company, safety is everything at Sasol. Before we start meetings, there's a safety moment on the agenda, which is a standing item on the agenda. So we are in the process of appointing a compliance officer, which will be a dedicated resource in Mozambique. It won't be based in Rosebank. It must be Portuguese speaking because you cannot manage risk from afar, and a desktop approach doesn't work. So the person is going to be based in Moz to ensure alignment of group compliance methodology with what's happening in Moz. And then we are also in the process of appointing a US-based compliance officer, even though we already have a US-based compliance officer, but it will be dedicated to this Lake Charles project. Okay, and then, okay, so these slides outlines the steps or the interventions that we've put in place at Sasol to promote a compliance culture. So we have compliance moments whereby any meeting, it's non-negotiable that there must be a safety moment and there must be a compliance moment. So what a compliance moment entails, for example, it's included in the last slide, so I'll give you the details in terms of the format of that compliance moment. And because we don't appear at the board as a standing agenda item at the board, Sasol board, we also send them 4 compliance moments to choose from because we don't have a time, but that gives us an opportunity in terms of promoting the compliance culture in the organization. So, and then we also have a compliance note, which we launched last month. That is a monthly publication on compliance issues, which is an endeavor to manage compliance risks. So what that contains is, because a vast majority of our employees are based in the mines and are illiterate, not every communication awareness reaches them. So that compliance note will be translated into languages like we have in terms of our code of ethics. For example, it's been translated to Mandarin, Spanish, German, English, and then locally we then translated to the local languages. So the compliance note, we unpack pieces of legislation which we feel are too complex for our employees to comprehend. Because as you know, in terms of the Labor Relations Act, you cannot discipline an employee for transgressing a rule that was not communicated to that employee. So that's part of an awareness drive. So what's also included in that compliance note, we've collaborated with ethics, because I'm also responsible for ethics, whereby what we've started doing is to share real-life examples where we illustrate that unethical behavior does not pay, or breaching the law doesn't pay. So, for example, we'll share anonymously so and protect the privacy of the transgressor. But in terms of substantiated cases, we will give a high-level outline that, for instance, there was an ethics call pertaining to this issue, and the outcome was a dismissal, for example, of that employee. So that was not done at Sasol. It's something that we've just introduced because they were not hiding, but we were worried about privacy, confidentiality. So we managed at least to reach a compromise by saying we won't publish the name of the transgressor. And then training and awareness, I've already touched on. At Sasol, when you join as an employee, there's a compulsory induction for a week. Even if you'll be based in Rosebank, you are going to go to Secunda. Because, again, like I said, the desktop approach doesn't work. You have to understand the essence and the core of Sasol business, which is primarily based in Secunda and Sasolburg. So it's compulsory that you attend induction in either Sasolburg or Secunda for a week. So that's part of training and awareness. And then there's an annual compliance certification, which is a unique feature in terms of trying to manage compliance risks. What that entails. So we have a multi-pronged approach in terms of managing compliance risks, but there's always a gap. We identified a gap in terms of, for example, compliance does compliance monitoring, not like all 12 months in a year. So what then happens is there's an annual compliance certification process whereby we identify a target audience of employees where there's a risk of non-compliance who are operational. So, for example, we also include competition law in the light of all the challenges we've had with compliance law compliance. So then annually you certify that you are not aware of any breaches of any applicable legislation. You are not aware of any transgressions of the Code of Ethics, and you're not aware of any transgressions of the anti-bribery and corruption policy and sanctions policy and Code of Ethics. So it's quite an important and excellent exercise in the sense that employees, even though they are unknown to us, we anonymously report that these are the non-compliances that have been brought to our attention via this process. So, and it's working very well, because we would not have identified or known some of the breaches if it were not for this, or some of the compliance risk, if it were not for this additional feature in our compliance program. Okay. And then tone at the top is also quite important, because it doesn't matter what we do as compliance, the risk or ethics. It won't work if there's no buy-in from senior management. So what we introduced at SASOL are so-called EXCO roadshows, whereby for all the MOEs which have divisional EXCOs, we do roadshows whereby the only item on the agenda will be compliance. So, and then we just give a high-level overview on compliance at EXCOs with the intention that it must be cascaded down to their employees. So, for example, in terms of one of the group risks, anti-bribery and corruption. So we'll package a communication which must be communicated group-wide by all the SVPs. So, I'm sorry, I'm using abbreviation, Senior Vice President. Yeah, so those must be communicated to all their employees. So that was informed. For example, we had challenges in Germany because the rules there are different, whereby in one quarter when we were supposed to do anti-bribery and corruption compliance, there was pushback. It turned out that there's no way we can come in to do compliance monitoring if that anti-bribery and compliance corruption policy was not rolled out and communicated to employees by specifically the SVP. So we decided to roll out that best practice group-wide at SASOL, so that there's that commitment from top management and they themselves communicate individually to their teams the message. And then the mood in the middle, I'll give you more details on the next slide. And then buzz at the bottom, we have ethics risk assessments, and which incorporates ethics and compliance. So that multi-pronged approach is important in the sense that we cannot define the risks sitting at Rosebank group-wide. So that gives us an opportunity where people on the ground who are operational get to tell us that these are the risks. So we then incorporate that feedback in terms of all the interventions that we put in place. And then collaboration with key stakeholders. So for example, in terms of regulatory updates, that is not a compliance responsibility, but it's important for us to be aligned with those regulatory updates which are communicated by legal. So we work closely with legal. So for example, in one of the entities, they were not aware that Consumer Protection Act was applicable, and then they obtained legal opinion from an external law firm. So then they came back and then involved us compliance to say, look, I mean, we have to now do an exercise to ensure that there's management of this compliance risk, of this risk, which we were unaware of, that it had an impact in terms of our business. And then risk I've touched on. Ethics collaboration is also quite key, whereby, for example, we will do a compliance monitoring, and it doesn't make sense for us to give a business a clean bill of health if you look at the ethics call, the trends speak a different story. For example, if we, like we've done on the supply chain management, there's a dedicated resource in terms of compliance officer who will do compliance monitoring. The feedback would be not a single finding, not a single breach. And yet if you look at the trends via the ethics line, there are lots of breaches which come through via the ethics. So we collaborate, whereby we exchange notes. Ethics team sit with compliance team and say, look, these are the compliance related risks that are coming through the ethics line, so that we focus on those as well. Okay, and then the reporting template talks to the previous slide in terms of the mood in the middle. So what happened is at Sasol, we identified a gap where every time we presented to the board, they would ask us how complete is this picture. And if something were to go wrong, I mean, how, as an assurance provider, is this a complete picture in terms of globally all the compliance risks that are facing Sasol? So what we then did, because we don't know what we don't know, we then introduced this template. This template is not completed by compliance. It's compulsory that all SVPs group-wide complete this template, whereby they notify us all the non-compliances on the ground that we are unaware of. And this is also relevant and important in the context of, if you look at the MTN case, where if something were to happen in Nigeria and the head office is here in Joburg, how do they know? How are these matters of non-compliance escalated to the group function? Because at the end of the day, we are accountable in terms of giving that assurance. So there'll be gaps in our report if we say, look, everything is 100%. So that compliance template is then completed by legal, compliance, and the MD or the head or the senior vice president of the business. So these are just the bullet points of the contents of that report. So this is also relevant. For example, at Sasol, stakeholder management is a different department. With that, I mean, if there's any communication from the regulator, it does not come to us as compliance. So things can fall through the cracks, whereby there's a fine, there's a penalty, and there's a compliance notice, but we were unaware of that compliance notice. Or Section 54s, especially in the mines, mine closures. So when we report to the board, that report won't be complete. It will have holes if they get to know that there was a mine closure which didn't capture in our compliance report. So these are the contents of the compliance report, which are not completed by compliance, but co-completed with business, which means business tells us what has gone wrong. And they must sign that these are all the non-compliances that they are aware of. So it's a brief summary of what happened during that quarter or the trends. And then any material significant regulatory interactions in terms of that business for the quarter, it's a quarterly report. And then regulatory reporting requirements, which is quite key in the sense that what we find out is some of the compliance notices that we receive from the regulator. It's a transgression of our failure to comply with the license terms and conditions, for example, or if a failure to comply with the reporting requirement. If you are licensed, that you have to report quarterly or 6 monthly or once a year. So we didn't have that oversight as group compliance. So we get that feedback and collect that data via this mechanism and process. And then potential compliance notices, penalties. This is quite key because in the group exco, the finance people sit there so that they can make provision for these pending fines. And also where there's a fine that has been imposed, so for example, in the MTN case, so that there's provision that, look, I mean, this is now not just a potential fine, but this is a fine that has been imposed against the organization, and you have to make a provision for that. And then we have a catch-all, whereby people have a tendency of finding gaps and loopholes and only tell us in terms of the bullet points that we've asked. And they won't give us feedback in terms of any compliance risks that they are aware of. So there's that catch-all phrase in the template. So I touched previously on the compliance moment, which is a standing item on the agenda in terms of all the meetings at Sasol. So this is an extract just to give you an example of what we do to unpack the compliance moment or any compliance issues to help educate the board and management. So, for example, we have terms of reference in terms of what a compliance moment must have. So, number one, it must be a topical issue which must be of relevance to Sasol. So, of which this was, especially us being a global company with cross-border operations. Then what we do, we outline facts that, for example, a fine was already imposed, but because MTN in Nigeria was still in talks with the government, they were under the impression that suspended the payment of the fine, which is not the case. So this was quite an important learning for Sasol. So that's what we do. We take something that has happened out there, like VW emission scandal, and then we unpack it So this is the most important slide. So where you say, oh, okay, you've outlined the facts in terms of what happened, what are the compliance risks for Sasol? So the MTN one was a big one for us, whereby we picked up in terms of that template, the previous slide, whereby business won't take any remedial action, which sort of heightens the compliance risk and exposure for the company, where they will say, no, we're still meeting with the regulators to talk about this, so, and they won't fix it. So this for us was quite an important learning, whereby just because you are in talks with the regulator does not mean you must not action whatever remedial action has been communicated to you, especially if it's a done deal, like it's a compliance notice. I've never seen any instance where a regulator issues a compliance notice and changes its mind. If there's a finally, it's fine. That's different way they can negotiate it down, but that doesn't eliminate that risk. So that was a big one for us, because compliance report after compliance report, you'll pick up a breach quarter after quarter that was not remedied, merely because they said, no, we're still in talks with the regulator. So that was an important learning for us. So that's point number one. And then it also spoke to, in terms of good corporate citizenship, ethical leadership, and good governance. As you saw, the share price dropped, and then the CEO resigned, because if you followed the news clip, there was a quote by PIC where they asked where was compliance, which also we used that as an opportunity, and we use this compliance moment as an opportunity to actually raise awareness in terms of the compliance risks in the organization. So, and then, so the third learning for us was the importance of stakeholder management. And we have learned this the hard way, especially at Sasol, where generally, in terms of the compliance risk, companies view regulators as the enemy, and they often have an adversarial relationship. So it's important to view especially regulator as our stakeholder. It's our important stakeholder. And going forward, we do have these frequent engagements with the regulators. So for example, at Sasol, we have learning day and we have coffee sessions. So what we then did, we invited all three regulators in terms of the NERSA space. So that was a big one for us, because it has never happened where a regulator has responded to any invitation, came to address us, because there was always that view that regulators are not one of us, it's them and us. So yeah. And then the role of risk and compliance, like I outlined, and a question was asked in terms of when I gave this presentation, whether if we didn't have the template, which I showed in the previous slide, is it possible that something similar to the MTN fine could have happened or could happen to Sasol? The risk is quite minimized, because that's how important that template is. Because if you communicate that these are the risks, say in Nigeria or Mozambique, and it turns out that you misrepresented the contents of that compliance template, then there'll be consequences, because we rely solely in terms of the honesty and the integrity of the data that is completed by the stakeholders in terms of that template. And then if you recall in the news, what happened is, that is quite important for us because we're a JSE listed company. If you recall in terms of the MTN case, the way that risk was so serious, they were supposed to take out to issue a sense announcement, which they failed to do, which led to the JSE delisting them before they could actually issue the sense announcement. So that's how important it is that you communicate to your stakeholders timelessly in terms of what is materially price-sensitive information. And you saw what happened to the share price after this compliance saga at MTN. So, and lastly, in terms of the importance that we extracted in terms of the MTN case, is that companies, especially for us, Sasol is a global companies that operate across national borders have an added responsibility of ensuring that their corporate values, for example, at head office, are integrated seamlessly throughout where they have operations globally. And you cannot have one set of values in one country and different set of values in another. This is quite important for us. So, for example, we also operate in Mozambique, which is a high-risk jurisdiction. And we often have this challenge whereby if we say, as a group, we don't pay bribes, then they come back in terms of the malls to say, our environment is different. You have so-called, I don't know how to put it in English. So like it's standard practice there that before a government official opens his mouth, put money down. Yes, so they expect us now to compromise in terms of the corporate values to accommodate what they want us to understand as unique, even though they're in breach in terms of our corporate values. So that was an important learning whereby you don't bend your rules and values because, I mean, look at what happened because it affected MTN globally, not just MTN Nigeria. So, do I still have time? That was the last slide. Thank you.